Thanks so much, Daphne, and thank you also to Vanessa for inviting me to give this webinar. I'm delighted to be here. So today I'm going to talk about providing abortion care in the United States in the wake of bans, restrictions, in the 2024 presidential election. And I'm going to do that by telling the story of a shield law practice, which is the Massachusetts Medication Abortion Access Project. Again, my name is Angel Foster. I'm a professor at the University of Ottawa, and my pronouns are she, her, anything respectful. So in terms of the agenda for today, what I'd like to do first is just to level set by providing a bit of an overview of abortion in the United States. I'm going to take us through a brief journey from Roe versus Wade to the more recent Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization Supreme Court decision. I'm then going to turn to talk a little bit about the history of mifepristone, which is one of the two drugs in the sort of gold standard medication abortion regimen that's used worldwide. And I'm going to talk about that history in the United States in order to set the context for the story of shield law provision. I'm going to talk a little bit about shield laws in general, but I'm really going to zoom in on the Massachusetts Medication Abortion Access Project, or the MAP, as a way of talking about innovative strategies for delivering abortion care in the wake of bans and restrictions. And then I'm going to end by talking about some of the implications for the 2024 presidential election, what that might mean for the US abortion landscape. Obviously, we are still on the hills and we are in the wake of that election, so a lot is uncertain, but I am going to talk about what we project are going to be some of the challenges within the next year. We'll then open it up for questions and discussions, and I'm really excited to hear feedback from folks. I wanted to say kind of two things just in general in framing this talk. The first is that I've been involved with global abortion work as a researcher and as an activist for almost 30 years. And I was actually in medical school when mifepristone was first approved in the United States and trained on how to provide medication abortion with mifepristone and misoprostol back in 2002. I've been doing abortion research in more than 24 countries and do both health policy and social science work. And so today I'm going to draw from some of the original research of my research group, as well as research that's been done by many, many others. I also wanted to make a note about language. I think it's important at the outset to recognize that any person who can become pregnant and sustain a pregnancy is someone who may want an abortion or have an abortion, and this isn't limited to any specific gender identification. However, the vast majority of people who have abortions identify as women and girls. The overwhelming majority of the clinical, public health, and social science research on abortion is focused on women. And in many cases, laws that criminalize abortion specifically target women, are constructed around gender binaries, and are rooted in both patriarchy and colonization. And so today I'm going to use both gendered and gender neutral or gender inclusive language depending on context. So let's begin with a brief history of abortion in the US. As I'm sure most of you know, in 1973, the US Supreme Court issued a decision called Roe versus Wade, which legalized abortion at the federal level and established a constitutional right to abortion through the right to privacy. However, almost immediately after the Roe decision, a series of appropriation bills restricted funding of abortion care such that federal health insurance streams, including those streams that cover care for low-income residents of the United States, could not be used to cover abortion care unless that abortion was necessary to save the life of the pregnant person or the pregnancy was the result of rape or incest. The Roe framework and then its subsequent rulings did permit the state to restrict abortion and criminalize abortion after viability, which is a moving target, but in the US has long been identified as around 24 weeks from the first day of the last menstrual period. Prior to viability, states were not permitted to criminalize abortion or to ban abortion entirely, but beginning in the 1990s, what the state was permitted to restrict access to abortion as long as those restrictions did not create an undue burden. What an undue burden is certainly something that's debatable, and your vantage point is really important here. Suffice it to say that in the 1990s and 2000s, states throughout the US started to impose a number of restrictions on abortion. This included waiting periods, state mandated counseling, the requirement for adolescents or those under the age of 18 to obtain parental consent or to notify a parent. States also started to require that patients not only have pre-abortion ultrasounds, but view or listen to the findings. And really in the 2000s, we saw the proliferation of what are called targeted regulation of abortion provider laws or TRAP laws that were really meant to create barriers for facilities to provide abortion care. These laws regulate everything from how wide the hallways need to be to the kind of lighting fixtures to the requirement that a provider of abortion care at a freestanding clinic have hospital admitting privileges. All of these restrictions were legally permissible under the Roe and its subsequent ruling framework and really restricted access in much of the United States. Combined with the federal funding restrictions, well before 2022, we saw real divisions in the United States in terms of how accessible abortion was. Mifepristone was approved for early medication abortion in 2000 by the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. I'll talk a little bit more about MIFI in a few minutes, but just to say this was one of the longest regulatory review processes in the FDA's history. And for the better part of 2 decades, mifepristone was very much encumbered by non-evidence-based regulatory restrictions, which really prevented mifepristone and medication abortion from living out its promise. In the years prior to Dobbs, we also see vigilante laws that were enacted first in Texas and then in Oklahoma. These laws restricted abortion effectively at 6 weeks of gestation by creating a dynamic where totally uninterested parties could sue any abortion provider or helper or someone who supported someone to get an abortion after detectable fetal or embryonic cardiac activity, which is generally recognized as being at about 6 weeks. And so by the end of 2021, there were virtually no abortions taking place in Texas after 6 weeks of gestation, and then Oklahoma followed suit in 2022. And I say all of this because this was all before the major legal shift that took place in June of 2022 in the Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization decision, or Dobbs. The Dobbs decision overturned nearly 50 years of precedent and eliminated the constitutional right to an abortion, and instead relegated abortion decision-making back to individual states and to the people and their elected representatives. What we have seen since Dobbs, and even immediately in the wake of Dobbs, was a truly horrific landscape developing. So immediately after the Dobbs decision was issued, a number of states had what were called pre-abortion bans that went into effect. These were bans on abortion that had been promulgated prior to the Roe decision in 1973, but had never been removed from the books. And so states like Wisconsin had a ban that had been on the books since the 1860s, actually had a ban on the books that was there before women had the right to vote, went into effect and prohibited abortion in basically all circumstances. A number of other states had what were known as trigger laws. So these were laws that had been passed after Roe and would go into effect if Roe was overturned. Some of these laws went into effect immediately. Some of these laws went into effect within 30 days. Some of these laws were challenged to varying degrees of success. But what we saw was trigger bans go into effect in much of the South and parts of the Midwest. There were also bans that went into effect around gestational age bans. And so these were restrictions that had been enjoined by the courts because they were in violation of Roe, because they were clearly in violation of the framework that Roe had set out. But with the overturning of Roe, these laws then went into effect. And again, some immediately and some within some kind of a grace period. And when I say immediately, I mean immediately. There were clinics in certain states that had patients who were in their waiting room, and when the Dobbs decision was released, couldn't provide abortion care to the people who were in front of them, needed legal advice on whether or not to complete procedures that they were in the middle of performing. So what we see now, and there continues to be an evolving legal picture, and we'll talk a little bit, and at the end of my talk about what the recent elections have mean for this state level abortion landscape. But what we have now are 13 states in the US that ban abortion for basically all reasons at all gestational ages. Technically, these bans have a life endangerment exception. Some of these bans have exceptions for pregnancies that are a result of rape and incest. But the reality is that it's very hard to get abortion care for any reason in states with full bans. There are now 4 states that have what are affectionately called 6-week bans. In almost all cases, these bans are actually not gestational age bans. They're about detectable cardiac activity, but that means in practice around 6 weeks. We have additional states that now have 12-week bans, so bans within the first trimester, and a couple of states that have bans that are in effect between 15 and 18 weeks. Right now in the United States, about almost 40% of women of reproductive age live in a state where there are greater restrictions on abortion pre-Roe, and about a third of women live in a state where there is a full ban or a 6-week ban. So in anticipation that Roe would be overturned, the National Abortion Federation, or NAF, which is the largest organization of abortion providers in the United States, commissioned a study to look at what would happen if Roe was in fact overturned. And the decision in Dobbs by the Supreme Court left the decision about abortion's status to individual states. And so these projections were released in 2022. So prior to Dobbs, there were about 300,000 abortions that occurred each year in the states that would likely become ban or restricted states. Um, and I will say that we've had some wins in this front. So for example, Michigan was a state that originally folks predicted might implement a ban, but that turned out to not be the case. But again, about 300,000 abortions were occurring in regions of the country or in states specifically where we thought there would be bans or restrictions. Based on financial projections and what we know about abortion seekers, NAF predicted that about 100,000 abortion seekers would be able to travel out of state for safe and legal abortion care. This assumes a couple of things. First, it assumed that there would be massive support from national and local abortion funds. And just to take you back to this map for a minute, I just wanted, I want to recognize that not many states with abortion bans don't border a state where abortion remains legal. And so this travel, especially if you're in Florida or parts of Alabama or Mississippi, can involve crossing multiple state borders in order to be able to get legal and safe care. And so this prediction of 100,000 abortion seekers being able to travel was really based on the idea that there would be funding consistently available to support that travel. This 100,000 abortion seekers, though, we also anticipated that many of these patients would require care at later gestational ages, mostly because it takes time to assemble the resources to be able to cross multiple states and be able to get abortion care, which also presents challenges because later gestational age abortion care is located in far fewer facilities and people might have to travel more. The projections from 2022 indicated that about 200,000 abortion seekers would not be able to travel out of state for their care. And the estimates at the time were that approximately 85% would carry a pregnancy to term, and that about 15% would either self-manage their abortion, and by that I mean using misoprostol with or without mifepristone outside of the formal healthcare system to have an abortion, or they would self-induce an abortion but through some other means. Overall, the grim reality was that these projections indicated that there would be an increase in maternal mortality and morbidity, particularly among Black women in the US South. And this is largely because of the proportion of people that would be required to carry a pregnancy to term and undergo childbirth. Black women, particularly Black women in the South, are about 3 times more likely to die in childbirth than white women. The bans are concentrated in states with large African American and Black populations. And this projection about maternal mortality and morbidity is really recognizing that pregnancy and childbirth carry risk, and that structural racism and punitive policies targeting those living in on low incomes really increase these risks for Black women. So when DOMS dropped, the question was, how can we change these projections? What can we do to ensure that those 200,000-ish people that want abortion care are able to get safe and effective care? Now, when we think about the history of mifepristone in the United States, I would say here is something that here we've got an almost 25-year history, 30 years if you think about when the dossier for approval was first submitted, but a lot of work has happened or a lot of changes have happened in just the last couple of years. So mifepristone, which is often referred to as the abortion pill, sometimes referred to by its drug development name, RU486, was developed out of France and first approved in 1988. Um, Mifepristone started to roll out next in China, then in much of Western Europe in the 1990s. And in the mid 1990s, a dossier was submitted to the US Food and Drug Administration to approve mifepristone and a prostaglandin, in this case, misoprostol, for use to terminate an early abortion. It took over 5 years for that regulatory approval to be announced. But in September of 2000, the US Food and Drug Administration officially approved mifepristone and misoprostol for early abortion use. The initial regulatory framework for the approval of mifepristone, matched the evidence that was available at the time, probably even then a little bit conservative because the dossier took so long to move through the system. But for a decade and a half, mifepristone had various regulatory impediments to its accessibility. And this came through both the way that the label was written for the drug itself and through something called a risk, something called a REMS, a risk evaluation and mitigation strategy. These two different regulatory mechanisms effectively made it difficult to increase access to mifepristone. In large part, and there are a lot of different pieces of this, but the key pieces for access today are that mifepristone was only allowed to be dispensed by the prescriber. And so it required in-person dispensing, and the drug could not be provided through pharmacies. And providers had to register in advance to be medication abortion providers. And this created a real barrier for someone to be able to offer kind of routine medication abortion care as part of primary care practice. We saw some regulatory changes that took place in the mid 2000s that extended the gestational age used to 10 weeks and allowed non-physician prescribers to offer medication abortion. And so even though the mifepristone trajectory was encumbered by these regulatory burdens, by 2020, about half of abortions in the United States were with mifepristone and misoprostol. But COVID really ushered in an opportunity to change the regulatory framework. And after a lawsuit, the US FDA first temporarily and then permanently lifted the in-person dispensing requirement for medication abortion. This first took place in COVID, and what we saw as immediate result was the increase in telemedicine medication abortion services, but those services were largely focused on states that were already access states, where there weren't all of these other kinds of burdens on obtaining abortion care. But what we saw from that was that there was a real appetite for medication abortion through telemedicine. And then, as I mentioned, in 2023, the FDA permanently lifted this in-person dispensing requirement, which allowed pharmacies to be able to distribute the medication or dispense the medication. And what we know is that by 2023, about 63% of all abortions in the US are with mifepristone and misoprostol. So when we talk about mifepristone and misoprostol, just to orient folks who are maybe not who are not medical specialists, mifepristone is a pill that's taken orally. It's followed 24 to 48 hours later by a number of misoprostol pills that can be taken in the cheek or through the vagina or under the tongue. It's about 98% effective when used through 12 weeks. Mifepristone and misoprostol can actually be used throughout pregnancy. But when we think about first trimester use, it's about 98% effective. And if we give more misoprostol, we can actually continue to have that 98 or so percent efficacy through the duration of the first trimester. Mifepristone and misoprostol is extremely safe. There are few contraindications and there are tolerable side effects. And importantly, when complications arrive, there's time to manage them. There's plenty of time for people to get to an in-person clinic to be able to get in-person follow-up if that's warranted. As a result, when we look globally, the World Health Organization recommends supporting the provision of mifepristone and misoprostol in low resource settings by a range of clinicians and health workers. And we know globally that mifepristone and misoprostol is highly acceptable to both women and providers. When mifepristone is not available or when it's inaccessible, misoprostol can be used alone with comparable safety and efficacy. The major difference is the abortion experience itself, not the safety or efficacy of that experience. And so what we've seen around the world is that there has been, over the last 2 decades, a real growth in the global evidence about demedicalized strategies for delivering both mifepristone and misoprostol alone. My research group has done a lot of this work, particularly around misoprostol alone. And what we found is that demedicalized strategies, that is trying to whether within or outside of the formal health care system, reduce the number of visits, the kinds of non-evidence-based medical requirements that have long attached to the use of medication abortion. That these demedicalized strategies are safe, effective, and acceptable. We know that women and other pregnancy-capable people are able to determine for themselves if they're pregnant and do not want to be, if they're eligible for medication based on gestational age, if they have contraindications or need follow-up. And we know that routine in-clinic pregnancy tests, ultrasound, and clinical examinations are not necessary. And in short, we can trust women and other pregnancy-capable people. So this sets the stage for the SHIELD laws. Now, June of 2022 is when the Dobbs decision is released. We did have a preview of it. There had been a leak in the months before. In the summer of 2022, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts legislature passed an act expanding protections for reproductive and gender-affirming care, which is affectionately known as the Massachusetts SHIELD Law. The SHIELD Law went into effect in July of 2022. And the SHIELD Law does a number of things. The first is that it protects providers, helpers, and funders from criminal, civil, or licensure penalties when they are engaging in legal reproductive health or gender-affirming services. Second, the SHIELD Law protects patient information, and it protects patients who travel to Massachusetts for care. And so, this law protects these patients and documents attached to them by, for example, asserting that the Commonwealth of Massachusetts will not turn over medical records if subpoenaed by an attorney general in an anti-abortion state. But the thing that makes the Massachusetts SHIELD Law, or made the Massachusetts SHIELD Law so novel and also comprehensive, was that effectively the SHIELD Law redefined the location of telemedicine abortion care. So for the purposes of medication abortion care provided by telemedicine, if the clinician providing that care is licensed in Massachusetts, a resident of Massachusetts, and physically in Massachusetts, then the patient is considered a resident of Massachusetts for the purpose of obtaining that care. And basically what the SHIELD Law has done is said that telemedicine takes place where the clinician is, not where the patient is. This really is a different framework for thinking about telemedicine and how it is that telemedicine is regulated. So once this law, laws are great, and it's wonderful that the Commonwealth has this SHIELD Law, but there was a real question about whether or not anyone would be able to take advantage of the SHIELD Law. These kinds of laws are only as innovative and novel as there are folks to take advantage of them. Now, over 10 years ago, a legal colleague and I founded a nonprofit that's based in Massachusetts called Cambridge Reproductive Health Consultants. We had founded that nonprofit specifically to do work in the medication abortion space that was sort of too controversial for other US-based organizations to operate in. And we've done a lot of work around demedicalizing medication abortion and creating innovative strategies for increasing access to medication abortion in low resource, legally restricted settings, including in many humanitarian settings. And so when the Shield Law went into effect, here we have a nonprofit that's registered in Massachusetts with folks who have been involved in demedicalizing medication abortion care for at that point, through CRHC through over a decade and career-wise 4 decades. And so we started to think about what it would look like to develop a Shield Law practice. We, a small team of us, spent 9 months, and I will just say, in conversation with many, many, many lawyers, trying to figure out what it would look like to build a practice that comports with the Massachusetts Shield Law, and that took the lessons that we had learned globally, but then applied them to the US context, both legal and regulatory. And this is where the Massachusetts Medication Abortion Access Project, or the MAP, came from. So the goals of the MAP are to provide high quality, evidence-based, affordable medication abortion care to abortion seekers in ban and restricted states. We don't think that the Shield Law was designed so that Massachusetts providers can prescribe pills to residents of New York. Clearly, the Shield Law was meant to address the moment created by DOMS, and so our focus is around abortion seekers in ban and restricted states. We also wanted to demonstrate the strength of the Massachusetts Shield Law. Nobody wants to get arrested. Nobody wants to be sued. Nobody wants to be delicensed. But our hope in establishing the MAP as a Shield Law practice was to demonstrate that Shield laws are protective, and to encourage other states to pass comprehensive Shield laws. And then our final goal was to create a practice model that could be replicated by groups in other Shield Law states. So the MAP is a values-based medical practice. Our care is evidence-based, and we place primacy on patient perspectives and affordability. And there are really two core values that undergird our service. The first is trust, and I'm going to talk more about trust in a few minutes, but just to say it's trust in our patients to make the decisions that are right for themselves given their own lived context, including the decision to have an abortion in a ban or restricted state. There's also trust in each other. Our team is small but mighty, but there's a lot of trust there in terms of how it is that we operate. But we also have a great deal of trust in the system. So we trust that the state of Massachusetts has our back and will protect us when and if there are lawsuits. Equity is the other value that undergirds the practice. So what do? We are an asynchronous telemedicine medication abortion service. We offer mifepristone and misoprostol to patients who first contact us within 11 weeks from the first day of their last menstrual period. Our goal is that patients will have the drugs in their hands by week 12, and they'll take them before the end of the first trimester. For the first year, our service charged $250, but we used a pay what you can model. We asked for patients to make a minimum payment of $5 and provided subsidized care to anybody who requested it. We offer abortion care to abortion seekers throughout the US, residents of all US territories, as well as military personnel and their dependents who have a military address anywhere in the world. But as I mentioned, our focus is on ban-restricted and telemedicine ban states. We do very much want to provide to patients in Massachusetts as well. When a patient from an access state where there's insurance coverage, including insurance coverage for low-income residents, contacts us, they receive an automatic reply that says, you seem to be contacting us from a state where abortion is legal and where there's insurance coverage from abortion. Here are some resources to get care closer to home, but if you still need our services, here's the link to complete our medical questionnaire. Unlike the work that I've done in a lot of my career, this project is part of the formal healthcare system. And we very intentionally comply with all Massachusetts telemedicine and abortion laws, regulations, and policies, including the ones that we disagree with. So for example, Massachusetts has a parental involvement law, which means that those who are under the age of 16 need parental permission to have an abortion. And so we don't provide care to patients who are under 16. We are a HIPAA compliant practice, which means that we adhere to the health privacy regulation and framework. All of our clinicians have malpractice insurance. All of our patients sign the agreement to use mifepristone, which is called the Mifeprex agreement. We report our numbers every month to the Massachusetts Department of Public Health, and we follow the National Abortion Federation's clinical policy guidelines. We are actually the first Shield Law member of NAF, which was sort of a huge step within the abortion landscape in terms of recognizing the legitimacy of shield law providers. So what do we offer? Our patients all receive 200 milligrams of mifepristone, which is one tablet. For those who are under 9 weeks, they receive 8 200 microgram misoprostol tablets. For those who are over 9 weeks, they get an additional dose. And we provide medication abortion care for patients who are asking for pills for immediate use. They know they're pregnant, they want to use them right away. We offer pills for people who want abortion pills for future use. So they're not pregnant. They know they're not pregnant, but they want to have them in their home, on their medicine in their medicine cabinet to be able to take in case of need. And we also offer medication abortion pills for those that want them for what we call period pills. So in this liminal space where it's around the time of their period, they're not sure if they're pregnant, but they want to take the pills, and they think that they've had an event in the previous months that puts them at risk of pregnancy. All of our patients receive an instruction sheet. They receive information about ectopic pregnancy. They receive information about how to use the pills at different times. So if they're immediate use patients, or future use patients, or period pill patients. We provide all of our patients with a national resources card that provides information about toll-free resources that are available around pregnancy options counseling, contraception, clinical management issues, legal issues, and we also direct people to a website that has information about pro-choice or abortion-friendly clinics that are in banned and restricted states, often those who used to provide abortions but no longer do. We give all of our patients information about digital privacy protection, and all of our patients receive a handwritten "We Wish You Were Well" card. We are an asynchronous telemedicine service, but we do respond to follow-up and questions, and we do that over secure email, over text, and over phone. So we do have a synchronous component. We use the NAF chatbot Chloe, and we have a website. And we send all of our patients questionnaires 2 weeks and 6 weeks after we've sent the pills in order to understand outcomes. Based on assurances that we have received from the Biden administration, we use the US Postal Service to send our packages. Most of our patients receive them via priority mail, so it takes 2 to 5 business days. I will say that about 3% of our packages never get to patients. And one of the ironies of this project is that it turns out that the US Postal Service has a higher failure rate than mifepristone. So we launched our service on September 28th of 2023, which was International Safe Abortion Day. And in our first year, we served nearly 5,000 patients. 35% of our patients are from Texas, and more than 95% of our patients were from banned, restricted, or telemedicine banned states. On average, we received about $130 per patient, but about a third of our patients paid $25 or less. And in order to cover that gap, we worked with 5 national abortion funds, 3 abortion funds in Massachusetts, and local funds in 6 banned or restricted states. I have to say, a lot of administration to try to provide subsidized care. We also received grants and donations through CRHC, which is a nonprofit, and these are tax-deductible donations that come through that entity. Our team is small but mighty. Although I'm one of the co-founders, I am not a prescribing clinician, but we have 4 prescribers, all of whom are medical doctors, but that's just coincidental. They could be other kinds of healthcare providers as well. We also have community engagement personnel, and we have operations personnel. For most of the first year, we paid a living wage to our office personnel, but most everybody else was either volunteering their time or donating as an in-kind contribution most of their time. And we relied tremendously on volunteers. So every month for the first year, we had a volunteer packing party where volunteers locally in Massachusetts would come to our office space. They would help pack up the packages that then we would be able to sell and that we would be able to send. And that really relieved pressure on our office staff. We also work closely with medical students for choice chapters at the 3 medical schools in the Boston area. And I've made a picture here. We've tried to make this fun and create an opportunity for kind of community ownership of this project. So our pill and packing parties also involve pizza and wine. In terms of what patients say to us, these are just from some of the emails we've gotten from patients after our service. It's not surprising people are extraordinarily grateful for being able to get this care and being able to get this care close to home. You're doing a great thing for women. Thank you for being there. Everything was simple and very helpful. I want to say thank you for making this possible to the women who need it and are not able to get this done in the state that they live in. And thank you for saving my life so I can still be here from our son. We get these messages every day. With some members of my team at the University of Ottawa, last month we published our first paper on the map, and this was a way of looking at what happened in the first 6 months of our service. The paper is entitled Trust Women, Characteristics of and Learnings from Patients of a Shield Law Medication Abortion Practice in the United States. And in this paper, we do a real deep dive into the first 6 months of operations of the MAP, in which we provided care to just under 2,000 patients. There's a lot in this paper, but a couple of things that I wanted to flag for this conversation today. One of the things that we looked at was our patient demographics. And here, I think one of the things that's really important is that we are providing our patient demographics largely match the demographics of patients who are getting in-clinic care in the South prior to Dobbs. There have been speculation that telemedicine services skew to providing care to more privileged people, both privileged with respect to race and ethnicity and privileged with respect to socioeconomic level. And that really does not appear to be the case in the context of our patient population. 84% of our patients in that first 6 months were from the South or Southeast or Gulf area. And 93% of our patients were requesting pills at or before 9 weeks for immediate use. So people are really requesting pills early. But the thing that was really striking and what happened as a result of this assessment was really about the money. So in that first 6 months, pretty consistent with what we had in our first year, was that the average patient payment was $134.50. About a third of our patients paid the full freight $250, and about 30% paid $25 or less, including the patients for whom we waived the $5 minimum payment. 65% of all of our patients needed to receive subsidized care, and they got that either from one of the abortion funds or because of the individuals or the in-kind contributions from the MAP. In a way that was really heartening, about 1% of our patients donated money to cover the care of other patients, and about 4% of our patients made additional payments after receiving care. Now, in the medical questionnaire, the intake questionnaire that we have for patients, we have an open-ended question where we ask patients to share anything else they want to about themselves. We created this question specifically around medical indications, but most of the people who fill out this question actually talk about their social lives. They're talking about their social history. And here's just a couple of quotes from patients. One of the things that we see with these comments is that they're almost all about money. So I'm a single mother of 3 beautiful girls. I'm only 24. I recently moved to a new state with no family, no help, just my kids, and I don't have the financial or physical help to care for any more kids. This was the result of an assault. I'm currently unemployed and making all of my income from helping my cousin clean houses and other odd jobs when I can. I have an 18-month-old and can't afford the medication, but this is my worst nightmare and I just really need some help. So where are we going from here, or what was our plan after this assessment, and how are we moving forward in year 2? The first is that our assessment indicated that there were some areas for service delivery improvements. So we now have implemented a kind of live office hours. We're having a new website. One of the things that I'm really excited about is that we've obtained some funding to be able to develop a virtual medication abortion doula support network. So I'd say about 5% of our patients have complex social histories and other needs and would really benefit from having some continuity of care and a touch point to walk them through the abortion process, and then also help them with other social support. So we're excited to be able to roll out a medication abortion doula program either at the end of this year or early 2025. We've also done a lot of work around community engagement, and that includes media work. And the media work has been tricky because of the legal risks associated with more public exposure. We dipped our toe in the media space by being involved with a New York Times piece that was released in February of 2024. As a result of that single New York Times piece, we received more than $300,000 in individual donations to support subsidized care. And as a result, we've actually designed a more strategic media program. So we've done work with the Boston Globe, with National Public Radio, with the Wall Street Journal, with Ms. Magazine, mostly to help build our donor base and increase legitimacy. Our community engagement work also involves working with local organizations in the states that we serve so that they can provide referrals to our service. So we have cards and stickers that we distribute locally that can go out to potential patients. And our community engagement work is also really about increasing the legitimacy of our service, which is probably the single greatest challenge. I invite you to consider for a moment what it might be like to be a 23-year-old woman in Texas. You've never been pregnant before. You're not in college, so you're not necessarily piped into a lot of organizations or other support networks. You never had an abortion before. You've never really thought about it, but all you've heard for the last 2.5 years is that abortion is illegal in Texas. You go online, you find our service, and you learn that a group of people in Massachusetts can send you FDA-approved medications in the mail within a week for $5. That sounds bananas. And so this legitimacy question is something we really struggle with. The media work has helped us with that because we can direct people to these pieces, but it's something that continues to be a challenge. We're doing work to engage clinics, especially surge clinics, to partner with them so that if they've got patients who have crossed state lines to get care and go back to their home state, but need, for example, more misoprostol, we can send that. And then we have a really robust research program. Many of my students at the University of Ottawa are leading various sub-projects. But the single biggest thing that came out of our 6-month assessment was the need to radically reimagine the way that we finance abortion care in the United States. So we know that abortion patients in the US skew to being people who are living on low incomes, and most of them are in states that do not offer state assistance to provide care. And so what has happened in the United States for the better part of 2 decades is a very large anonymous donor has backfilled abortion payments using a fee-for-service model. And this very large anonymous foundation spends about $100 million a year to finance low-income people's abortion care, and does this by matching individual people, often after quite extensive and intrusive questioning, with a certain amount of money to get them to a facility. Sometimes the facilities are paid for that care directly, but it is a very expensive and inefficient process that also creates the need for people to tell their stories to multiple people, and the funding simply isn't enough. So for the last almost year, I've been pitching to funders all over the place that we need to think differently. And the big idea is to move toward a system that is more akin to something that is single payer. And finally, after a lot of work, a foundation bit, and now our service has changed its operations. So a foundation has now covered the operating costs of the MAP for a year with the goal is for us to provide as much care as possible to as many patients as possible and to see what happens. And so now we are offering abortion care for $5 or more rather than $250 or less. We are transparent with our patients about how much the care costs. We make it clear that $5 is our minimum, but we'll waive it. The pills, the package inserts, and the postage cost $75. If patients pay $150, they get all of that and express mail. And if they pay $250, it helps pay it forward. So what happened? We were serving about 500 patients a month in our first year, and in October, we served nearly 2,000 patients. So clearly people want and need and like $5 abortions. The proportion of patients from banned and restricted states has remained the same. So that's been really interesting. It was not suddenly that we started to provide subsidized care or highly subsidized care to patients in New York and California. The average payment that we received from patients was $55. So not $5, but not the $75 that we need to cover the per patient costs. So we continue to need support from funds and individual donors, but we've been more than able to cover that through our funding networks. What we also were really able to demonstrate is that this model is feasible and sustainable with philanthropic support. And we think that this can be expanded to other parts of the abortion care landscape. I will also say that another thing happened in October. And here, I won't get into the weeds of this court case now, but I'm happy to talk more about it in the discussion. But just to say, in 2023, a group of anti-abortion activists founded an organization in a district in Texas in order to be able to sue the U.S. Food and Drug Administration based on their approval of mifepristone. This group of people that were not abortion providers and made some sort of spurious claims about the safety and efficacy of mifepristone, claimed that mifepristone should never have been approved and wanted the FDA to rewind the clock to 1999 or at least until 2015 and basically reinstitute a lot of those cumbersome non-evidence-based requirements. This case snaked through the court system for a year and a half. Finally, the Supreme Court of the United States earlier this year issued a ruling that said that this initial group of clinicians didn't have standing to sue. But in the intervening period, 3 attorneys general from Idaho, Missouri, and Kansas wanted to join this case. And they were permitted to do so at the lower court level, but were not permitted to do so at the Supreme Court level. And in October, these 3 attorneys general filed their case to challenge the FDA's approval of mifepristone. What is interesting about this, and so first, let me just say, and I say this as a non-lawyer, it is bizarre to me that the attorneys general of 3 states, Idaho, Kansas, and Missouri, can file a case in a Texas court. They do that because there's a single judge in this federal district court, and the judge is vehemently anti-abortion, so it's the most sort of naked form of judge shopping. It is probably the case that this case will get kicked for jurisdictional issues. Shield law providers are not a part of this case. We are not named in this case as we are not a party to this case. But one of the things that happened in October with this filing is on page 2, the picture of our packing party and what we put in our inserts are actually in the filing from the attorneys general. And there are pages of this 199-page ruling about the map and about shield law providers. And so one of the things that we know is that these attorneys general are now going after the shield law providers, even if we're not a party to this particular case. So in terms of where shield law provision is now in the US, 8 states now have comprehensive shield laws. I've listed them here. There are currently 6 providers of, there are currently 6 shield law providers. 8 Access is by far the biggest and the longest history. It's a shield law provider that's comprised of clinicians that are in different states that are all operating under shield laws. We're the only other service that provides in all 50 states, and we're a shield law practice. Of the other providers, the Armadillo Clinic out of California is the other shield law practice in the U.S. So one that's grounded specifically in state-based laws, policies, and regulations. The most recent surveillance data indicate that about 20% of all abortions in the United States now are through telemedicine, and almost all telemedicine abortion care in ban-restricted and telemedicine ban states is coming through shield law providers. Shield law providers are now providing about 10,000 abortions per month in ban and restricted states. And I'll just end this part of my talk by saying shield law provision is one part of the post-Dobbs abortion landscape. It's an innovative strategy to expand access to affordable abortion care, but it's not a panacea and it won't be for everyone. And then there was November 5th. So as I'm sure all of you know, the presidential elections took place last week. Obviously, the top bill is the outcome of the presidential election in which Trump was elected to his 2nd term in office, albeit one with a gap. One of the interesting things that happened in this election that got a lot of coverage in the US had to do with 10 ballot initiatives in 10 different states that were either designed to fortify abortion rights or to restore abortion rights to something, in most cases, akin to the abortion rights that were in existence prior to the overturning of Roe. In 7 of those states, the ballot measure passed. In Florida, 57% of people voted to restore abortion rights up until viability. Unfortunately, in Florida, the threshold was 60%, so the ballot measure itself didn't pass. And I say this because we had 2 things happen during this election. We had somebody who is vocally anti-abortion and who appointed the jurists who ultimately overturned Roe and who has bragged about that, elected, and we had still in a number of states in the US expressions of abortion rights. The immediate outcome here, I will say though, from us, and I'm incredibly depressed by these election results. And I went to bed on Tuesday night thinking to myself, I'm going to take the rest of the week to regroup, to grieve, to mourn, to process, and then, I will emerge. I will emerge after the weekend, uh, you know, up for fighting another day. And when I woke up on Wednesday morning and looked at our inbox, realized that requests for pills had skyrocketed. So we have an initial welcome form each day. We get somewhere between 120 and 150 people filling out that form. A subset of those then complete our medical questionnaire. A subset of those are approved. A subset of those pay. On the day after election, more than 1,000 people had completed that welcome form. And what we're seeing is a tremendous increase in requests for pills for future use. And so we have a patient from Virginia who says, I'm very scared of what will become of my rights with the outcome of this election. Another afraid of the Trump administration and want to have these pills in case I or someone in my community needs them. I will say that yesterday we provided pills to 250 patients. So what does the election results mean? That's kind of where we are right now. And first, I'll just say that we don't anticipate anything to change until after January 20th, which is when the inauguration will take place. But there are two different kinds of things that will happen in the wake of the new administration. The first is what the Trump administration can do on its own. And then the second is what the Trump administration could do with congressional support. And it still depends a little bit on how Congress is ultimately composed, although we now anticipate there will be a Republican trifecta. What do we think is going to happen though with the Trump administration, and what the Trump administration can do on its own as executive in its own as the executive? The first has to do with executive appointments. For sure, the Trump administration is going to appoint an FDA commissioner who is going to be opposed to abortion care. Of that, we have no doubt. What the FDA commissioner can do in terms of rolling back the clock on mifepristone is an open question, but we expect that the FDA commissioner, probably within the first 100 days, will reimpose the in-person dispensing requirement, which will create challenges for telemedicine abortion care. The Trump administration will also very likely engage in some executive orders. I'm going to talk about the second one listed here first. For sure, the Trump administration, probably on day one and certainly within the first 3 days, is going to reinstate what's called the global gag rule. Happy to talk more about this in the question and answer period, but just to say every Republican administration since Reagan has reinstituted the global gag rule within the first week of coming into office. The global gag rule has historically prevented U.S. family planning assistance from being that's given to organizations outside of the United States from being used to provide abortion, talk about abortion, or advocate for abortion. The Trump administration, in its first iteration, actually expanded the global gag rule not only to include all federal US funding streams, not just family planning assistance, but also the gag rule now attaches to any sub-awardee of any organization receiving federal money. We know that's happening. It's devastating for international family planning and abortion care. The second thing that will probably happen, although we don't know when, has to do with resurrecting a zombie law called the Comstock Act of 1873. This Comstock was an anti-vice crusader who created an act, who is the named person of an act that prevented the use of the mail or common carriers, that prevented the mail or common carriers from being used to send or transport contraceptives, abortifacients, pornography, or any other obscene thing. There is a very long legal history that has gutted this act, but the act is still on the books. The Biden administration made it very clear that their interpretation of Comstock did not prevent the use of sending abortion pills or devices through the mail. We anticipate the Trump administration will change that. We know that the executive can enforce through different agencies, can enforce state laws. So the Biden administration has given us assurances that they won't serve, subpoenas or warrants that are issued by the Attorney General of Texas. We anticipate that will no longer be the case. We know that the Department of Justice is going to change, and it's horrifying to think of who's, at least being floated as the new Attorney General. But just to say that the Department of Justice and the Solicitor General's office under the Biden administration has been a party to a number of these cases that have helped protect limited abortion rights, and we anticipate that the new Department of Justice will withdraw from that. And of course, the Trump administration will have the opportunity to make a lot of judicial appointments, both at the lower court level and likely at the Supreme Court level as well. In terms of what can happen if there's congressional support, for sure, there will be increased restrictions on funding for both contraception and abortion through a variety of different mechanisms, the most important of which are what are called Title X clinics or federally qualifying health centers. We also know that there's been floating of a national abortion ban. Republicans have, proposed this in the Senate, under the Biden administration, but it went nowhere. And that ban could include a gestational age ban or a reason ban. And we know that the Republicans have threatened to make significant changes to the Affordable Care Act, which is one of the major mechanisms that governs healthcare in the United States, and that will have impact for a whole bunch of sexual and reproductive health services. So what are we doing as the MAP? First, I just want to say the devil is in the details. What happens, how quickly, how publicly, whether or not there are legal challenge, all of that stuff has yet to be worked out. We are in the process now of having meetings with the governor's office and with the Attorney General of Massachusetts to figure out how we can collaborate on this. But our goal is to provide until the bitter end. One of the things that has happened since Dobbs is that a lot of people have been afraid to test or push legal boundaries. And so we've seen a lot of self-censorship in the abortion space. We don't want to participate in this. We're going to continue until we can no longer provide a legally compliant service. So in terms of what we're doing, the first is that we've used a lot of these donations to stockpile mifepristone. It's been amazing to be able to have, literally $250,000 of mifepristone in a small office to make sure that we have supplies that we can continue to get out the door. We'll also we will consider switching to a misoprostol only regimen if mifepristone is in some way regulated such that we can no longer send it through the mail. We are talking about what the lawsuits and the legal challenges would be, both in the context of mifepristone and in terms of the Shield law states. So we're working on an amicus brief to be filed against the Attorney's General claim. And then the other thing that we're doing with the understanding that we may need to close is that it's important for us to document the story and the lessons learned from the MAP, with the hope that in whatever the next iteration of abortion care is in the United States, these lessons can help inform that work. So I wanted to leave with a couple final thoughts. The first, and I'm sure this audience all understands this, abortion is essential healthcare and needs to be treated as such, but it's also an issue of human rights, social justice, and reproductive autonomy, and we can hold both things to be true at the same time. I want to also just say, I think innovative strategies for service delivery of abortion that is outside of the formal healthcare system are incredibly important, and those are happening in the United States right now. And abortion is essential healthcare, and it should remain part of the health system in the United States. We can and we must innovate in the face of challenges. I think that COVID provided a real opportunity for innovation in terms of moving the needle on telemedicine abortion, particularly in the United States and in the United Kingdom. The Shield laws in the wake of Dobbs allowed us to further expand abortion. And in some cases, like states like Mississippi, there is more abortion that is more affordable today than there was prior to Dobbs. I don't know exactly what the new innovations are going to be under the Trump administration. I'm not sure that I will even be a part of them. I'm having a hard time thinking outside the box more than I already have been, but there will be more innovations of that, I am confident. Resistance can take many forms and may involve risks that evolve. And I think one of the things that we've really tried to look at with this project is how to both distribute risks. So we use a distributed risk model, but also be really open and honest about the risks that we're all prepared to take. So for example, since founding this project and being publicly associated with it, I will not travel to or through ban states, and I won't drive a car outside of Massachusetts. I think it's also, I just want to end by saying it is an incredible privilege to be able to undertake engaged scholarship. And if it weren't for my perch at the University of Ottawa, I wouldn't have the support that I need to be able to do this work. And so I feel just very grateful every day for being able to do that. And with that, I'm really excited to open it up to any questions that people have. And my stuff is here. I will make sure that it's here. I can also make my slides available. I will say I'm in Australia because I'm working with my colleague, Dr. Lisa Wynn, on a book that's will drop next year. Abortion Politics and the Pill That Promised to Change Everything. It's about the global journey of mifepristone. And some of what I've talked about in this talk today will be in that book.
Thank you. That was fantastic. I encourage people to use the Q&A function to ask their questions. I have one that I just wanted to begin with, and this comes from some work that I have done in Latin America, where organizations have started counseling programs to talk to women about how to present at hospital if they are miscarrying or having an abortion. And I'm wondering if I know the complications are extremely low rate, but to the extent that you have complications, do you offer any advice to people about what to say?
We do. So every patient receives in their instructions for use information about what to do if they need in-person follow-up care, including what to say. And we encourage people, we tell people they do not need to tell anyone that they have taken these pills. They can present with vaginal bleeding or cramping and say, I've had a positive pregnancy test. We give people language that they can use. And when we work with our patients on individual treatment plans, which we do when there are complications, and we usually do this by phone over email, we're even more explicit, which is that, if we're trying to figure out what we need to see on an ultrasound, making sure that the patient knows that this is the kind of information we want in order to determine a treatment plan. Here are the kinds of things you can ask for. Here's what we would encourage you to say. We do a lot of that.
And you know, you say that between all of you, all of the Shield Law people, or organizations, you're performing about 2,000 abortions or 10,000 abortions a month. That's like a drop in the hat, obviously, to the overwhelming numbers. Where do you think people are going outside of your organizations? What are some of the other places you think that people are going?
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. So the surveillance indicates now that there are actually more abortions that are taking place in the United States than there were prior to Dobbs. So right now prior to Dobbs, it was about 1 million abortions a year. Now there's about 100, like 1.1, 1.2 million abortions a year that are taking place. So the overall number of abortions has increased, and there's a lot of speculation about why. At 10,000 abortions a month that are taking place from Shield Law providers. So if you think about that number, if we think about those projections, it's about 120,000 abortions that are taking place each year. Those are only in the banned and restricted states. Again, some Shield Law providers are providing in more in access states as well. So that's where our overall telemedicine numbers are going up. So there's still a gap, but between that and the people who are traveling, which is actually also still, it's probably over 100,000 patients a year are able to travel. We are closing that gap on what was projected. Those who are not getting abortions through Shield Law providers or through travel are either remaining pregnant, and we know that that is happening. We don't have great numbers on that yet, but it certainly is part of the dynamic. Or are using community-based networks. And there's a couple of formalized community-based networks. Some are more state-based, some are sort of regional, that are really modeled after what we've seen in a lot of Latin America, where there are accompaniment models, where they're using misoprostol alone, where they're ferrying pills often from across the border with Mexico and bringing them in. Some are sending them by mail. And those networks are providing care. The estimates were that sort of in the year after Dobbs, it was probably about 40,000 abortions were being provided through those community-based networks. And then you can also go online and buy pills from online pharmacies. And we don't have a great sense of how many people are doing that. I will say at this point, pills from Shield Law providers and from community networks are cheaper than buying pills from an online pharmacy. So almost all of the advocacy groups in the United States, while not wanting to take anything away from online pharmacists that are sending pills from India, which are high quality pills and it all works, almost all the advocacy organizations are trying to direct people to either Shield Law providers or community-based networks, so that there is someone who's there to be able to provide support and more information, rather than just getting a random package of pills in the mail.
Okay, thank you. So the first question we have is actually someone who would like to be reminded about the Global Gag Act and what it is and what it includes.
Sure. So the global gag rule was first implemented by Reagan in 1984. It's called the Mexico City policy. And the idea behind the global gag rule was that it was one of a number of mechanisms to limit the way that US federal dollars are implicated in abortion care. The global gag rule is, there has long been a rule called the Helms Amendment that has prevented the use of federal dollars from supporting the provision of abortion care outside of the limited exceptions of life endangerment, rape, and incest. But the global gag rule, when it was first implemented, went even further and said not only can organizations outside of the United States receiving family planning assistance not provide abortion care, they also can't talk about abortion care and can't advocate for abortion care, irrespective of the laws around abortion in the country, right? And this created some real challenges because you can have national laws that require where abortion is legal and it's required for those who are providing care to offer that information. South Africa is certainly a good example of that. Tunisia is another one. And so this federal funding gag, which basically said if you get $1 of US family planning assistance money, you can't talk about abortion, advocate for abortion, or provide abortion care, was really complicated. It's always been bad. It's never done the thing that the anti-abortion folks want it to do. It does not result in a reduced number of abortion. It's a terrible, terrible policy on every level. What became different under the Trump administration was two different additional phases that made it just so much worse. The first was that the Trump administration expanded the global gag rule to any funding out of the US government. So not just family planning assistance, but all kinds of US foreign assistance, including things like HIV and AIDS funding and funding that might go through kind of other major mechanisms. The other thing that ultimately the Trump administration did was further extend it. So it's not just the organization that receives the money, but it's any organization that receives money from that organization has to abide by the global gag rule, even if those subawardees don't get any money from the US government. And basically, it has just meant that organizations that work in comprehensive family planning or family planning in general can't take can't take US family planning money because it's just the tail of these restrictions is just too long. And so we anticipate that it will not only be the global gag rule, but it will be the Pompeo version of the global gag rule, which just further restricts not only action but speech.
Yeah, it's crappy, crappy law.
It's awful in every possible
Yeah.
way, and doesn't do any of the things that the advocates purport that it does.
Yeah. I had one person who asked if perhaps you could put a link in the chat for people who might want to donate or offer to volunteer, if there's a way to link people up with the project.
Absolutely.
I have a question here about the potentially perverse consequences of having the pills be available for only $5, and whether you have any concern that there will be hoarding or exploitation, and what you do to have checks and balances around that.
Yeah, it's a great question. And so first, like I mean, fundamentally, I think that medication abortion pills should be as available as possible. I think they're safe enough to be available over the counter. That's not how they're regulated right now, but that's certainly the safety and efficacy profile is like that. In which case, I want people to have unfettered access to medication abortion pills, and I have no problem with somebody having multiples on their shelf and keeping them and distributing them to friends in the way that you would do with other over-the-counter medications. Having said that, given that we're having to subsidize this care, that's not necessarily the most financially sustainable model. And so part of the reason that we actually charge people is because in Massachusetts, we are not required to obtain IDs in order to provide telemedicine care. And so by having people make a payment, that is a way to make sure that there is actually an identity that's behind that. They have to use one of these payment platforms. For us, it's less about sort of hoarding or getting multiple pills and reselling them. I'm sure that happens a little bit, but I think it's on the margins. It's really about being swarmed by anti-abortion advocates, where we realized early on that if 10,000 requests came in for free pills or for $5 pills, if we didn't have a mechanism of attaching it to a payment, so if we got 10,000 requests for free pills, we could go out of business instantly. and could just be swarmed by antis who were doing it for nefarious reasons. And so that's why we created the minimum payment and why we waive it if a patient contacts us, because then we've had an exchange with that patient and have an ability to kind of verify who they are. Do we think that people are getting pills from us and selling them, diverting them? Yes, we are, and we think that that's true, and this is one of the things that we want to do research on, particularly in terms of what's happening with future use pills. I expect that people are getting them, and then they're giving them to somebody in their dorm who needs them, right? Like I can totally see that dynamic. Um, and so we want to understand that more, but I don't think it's happening a lot.
I have a question about what women in Canada can do. Well, it's actually a question about what do you believe Canada has a role in supporting women in the US to access abortion care. I just also want to add my own question around that, which is, do you think it's ironic that in fact through shield laws and especially what you're doing, women in some places have more access than women in Canada?
Yeah, I mean, there is a deep irony about what has happened in the post-Dobbs landscape. And so, first, I just want to say, like, Dobbs is horrible. This is a human rights tragedy and a massive social justice inequity. There is nothing that is good about a Dobbs decision that takes rights away from people, for sure. And having said that, the implications of Dobbs are really interesting, that it has been devastating for obstetrics, for people with wanted pregnancies who have complications, who need other care. These are the folks who are unable to get the care that they want. These are the very public stories about this. It has not been as devastating because of the shield laws and because of all of the attention that is now on medication abortion for medication abortion. And so when we look at a state like Mississippi, Mississippi was the site of the Dobbs decision, right? So Dobbs, the Jackson Women's Health Organization was in Mississippi. Prior in 2020, there was one clinic in Mississippi. It was the Jackson Women's Health Organization. Medication abortion cost $800. Because of all of the state regulations, you had to make 3 in-person visits to be able to get medication abortion care. The state doesn't subsidize care, so people had to pay out of pocket, and anyone in the state had to travel to that one clinic multiple times. Some people in Mississippi traveled outside of Mississippi for their care, but often those surrounding states also required multiple visits. So it was time intensive, it was expensive, and that's for medication abortion care. So not surprisingly, we saw more people wanting instrumentation abortion procedures because at least they'd be done, right? They'd go in, they'd be unpregnant by the time that they left, even if they had to come back. And in 2020, about 3,600 abortions took place in Mississippi. In 2024, based on aid access and our numbers, we think that number of abortions in Mississippi is going to be about 5,000. And there are just as many people traveling out of Mississippi as there were before, if not more. So there is better access to affordable medication abortion care in Mississippi today than there was prior to Dobbs. And that doesn't take away from the human rights tragedy that is Dobbs, but there's a deep irony there. And so, Daphne, to your point, there is this thing about sort of what has happened with this kind of innovative strategy where now we have affordable care that's actually moving out through telemedicine in places and to populations that didn't used to have access to that care. And one of the things that we've seen, the one major demographic difference of our patients and the aid access patients in comparison to abortion patients prior to Dobbs is that we have a much higher number of people who have 4 or more children. And I think what's happening is that we are actually now able to provide abortion care to a subset of people who really didn't have care before. This was an unmet need. It was hard to make multiple visits to for an in-clinic abortion or to get your pills from a clinic in Mississippi. Imagine if you had 4 kids or 6 kids, or maybe because you couldn't get the abortion you wanted, that's part of the reason why you have 6 kids. And now those are folks who are able to get care from our service. So I think that's been a really kind of exciting thing and something that we're really trying to understand more. It's not just that we're replacing care, it's that we're actually meeting what was unmet need before. And I think that's true with folks who have large families. I think that's also true with sort of rural white populations in especially conservative areas where not only is the state conservative, but going into an urban environment to get an abortion would require telling other people in your household or in your community and in these like white evangelical communities in the South. I think those were folks who were not having abortion care, but maybe wanted them and needed them. And so that's another population we may be, need we may be addressing. In terms of Canada, I think there's this really kind of complicated relationship between the US and Canada around abortion care. I would say immediately as a result of Dobbs, the thing that was most concerning in terms of Canadian abortion seekers was what was going to happen with the all trimester clinics in parts of the United States that are serving the Canadian patients who need abortion care after 24 weeks and who historically, and by that I mean over the last 15 or so years, have almost all come to the United States for abortion care that's after 24, 25, 26 weeks. And it's not that those facilities aren't still available, it's that they're now having to accommodate so many more people because of this shift that's happening within US provision, that there was a real concern that Canadians wouldn't be able to get the care they needed. I think it's lit a fire under some of the Canadian abortion rights organizations to really think about how to fortify later gestational age abortion care in Canada and what it looks like to make sure that that landscape is more robust and that there are more that there's greater consistency and provision after 20 weeks and certainly after 24 weeks in different kinds of hubs to be able to help people move around to be able to get that care. Because of the way that mifegamizole is regulated in Canada and because of how expensive it is, I don't anticipate that Canada is going to be able to be involved in the same way around medication abortion distribution. I know there's some questions that have been coming up about that and speculation about it. And how hard is it to like mail pills from Canada to the United States? And I hear that within the Shield Law space. And I think this is, mifegamizole is a wonderful option in Canada. It is expanded access, and the lack of affordability of that will make that would make that complicated to be a strategy to expand access in the US.
I agree.
I actually cannot see where to, maybe I can find a chat. I've been trying, I don't think I actually have access to the chat feature to post um, the link, but I can reshare my final slide and you can see what I'll share that before we close, and you can see what website to go to that has information about the service, but then also, how to donate or how to volunteer.
I have two logistics questions.
Yes.
I'll group them together. One is asking whether you provide information sheets in different languages and support in multiple languages. And the other is what you do in a case where the packages aren't delivered or are lost. Do the clients have to pay again?
Yeah. So for the multiple languages, we have our materials in Spanish, and so we provide them in Spanish. We typically send them to patients rather than print out hard copies because we don't necessarily we prepackage these boxes with the materials, so we don't know. And on a case-by-case basis, we can provide additional language material or materials in additional languages. I will say Spanish is by far the thing that we need the most, so we've worked on having those resources available. We do interact with our patients in a number of different languages. They're, members of our team speak and write in a number of different languages, but I also have to say, Google Translate is so much better now than it was a while ago. So we muddle through even if it's a language that our team doesn't have expertise in. But we have prioritized Spanish language materials. For patients that don't get, basically, if we send a package of pills to somebody and they don't get it, we send another package of pills. We have tracking on all of our packages, and so we ask patients if the USPS system indicates they've received the pills, like to check with their neighbors, to check other people in their building, to wait a day or two to just see if it's been misdirected. But we want people to get the abortion care that they need, and we trust that if people tell us they haven't gotten the pills, they haven't gotten the pills, and we need to send them more pills. We have seen a couple of cases where people have had their pills sabotaged by people in their lives, and so then we work with the patient to try to identify a different address to send the pills to, because sending it back to the same place where your partner or mother-in-law or roommate or whatever has destroyed the package, that's not an efficient way to get somebody the pills they need. So we work with them on a case-by-case basis, and we don't require them to pay.
Okay. Asking whether you can please elaborate on how the Dobbs decision affected obstetrics.
Great. And so, as I mentioned before, in states that ban, so the first thing it just has to do with abortion bans and restrictions that involve fetal cardiac activity. These bans almost all have some kind of life exception. Um, but many of them don't have an explicit health exception. Many of them do not include abortion care for fetal anomalies, whether lethal or otherwise. And so what we're seeing in the post-Dobbs era is that folks who have wanted pregnancies and need an abortion, either because something has gone wrong with that pregnancy, so they're experiencing PPROM, or they're having preeclampsia, or they're having some kind of bleeding that's leading to infection, or they learn something about the pregnancy and specifically about the fetus, they're not able to get abortion care. And part of it is, about how hospitals in particular, and I would say lawyers at hospitals even more specifically, are interpreting these bans. And so what we've seen are in states like Idaho, where Idaho has one of the most extreme abortion bans, is that and this has all been women at this point, but women with obstetric emergencies are actually getting medevaced outside of the state to get care in hospitals in another state because doctors are unsure about whether the intervention would violate state law. Most of these state laws are also still evolving, but just to say, many of these states with these really draconian bans, the burden is on the clinician to prove that the intervention was required. The default isn't that it was the standard of care. The clinician has to prove it. So that creates another kind of burden. It requires now that doctors have to know the law in ways that are unusual for most medical providers, and laws that are uncertain. And so one of the things that we had seen this last year is a case that's called EMTALA. So um, several decades ago, the federal government passed a law called EMTALA, which requires emergency departments to treat the patient that is in front of them. And this law was created because hospitals were dumping low-income patients. So someone would show up at a hospital, they didn't have insurance, the hospital would turf them, and then they would ultimately go to a safety net hospital. And EMTALA basically said, if you get money from the federal government, which almost all hospitals do through various mechanisms, if you get money from the federal government and you have an emergency department, you have to treat the patient that's in front of you, and you've got to provide standard of care. And the Biden administration issued guidance after the Dobbs decision that said sometimes providing an abortion is the standard of care. And in order to be compliant with EMTALA, you have to, if you're an emergency department and a patient needs stabilizing treatment that requires an abortion or requires a uterine evacuation, you have to do that. And the state of Idaho and the state of Texas challenged the federal government and said, nope, that comes against our abortion ban. And so this snaked its way through the courts, and ultimately the US Supreme Court punted on this case and sent it back down to the lower courts to kind of reconcile, because there had been some changes in the minutia of the wording of the Idaho law. And I think everybody agrees that this was the Supreme Court just not doing its job. This is also one of those areas where we now don't expect that the Trump administration is going to issue the same guidance. And so that's a really good example of how it's like federal agencies have been saying, you're not treating the patient in front of you, you're dumping them by like sending them, medically evacuating them to another state, you're requiring people to be pregnant until they're at the brink of death. This is not appropriate care. And so when I say it's bad for obstetrics, this is what I mean. Pregnancy is complicated. Abortion is part of pregnancy. Like, it is one of the tools that's in the clinician toolbox for how it is that we manage pregnancies of various kinds. And to say you can't use this one tool, you can't use this one technique, is really really ties the hands of clinicians. And we've seen that with deaths that have happened, that are getting increasingly reported on out of these states.
I think this will probably be our last question, asking whether you think misoprostol will ever get restricted in the US, or will it be kept on the shelves for stomach ulcers, but in reality be used for abortion care, and is it easily found in most pharmacies?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And so here I think that the answer is a little bit complicated. I think at least immediately mifepristone or misoprostol will continue to have its same regulatory status, which is that it's a prescription drug. It's available in a lot of pharmacies with a prescription. It's used off-label for all of its obstetrics and gynecological purposes because it's only been registered in the United States for for the purpose of preventing gastric ulcers, though it's rarely used in that way. I think that will continue. Having said that, there are two ways that this can be interfered with. The first is that Comstock Act. So if a more expansive definition of Comstock comes into play, which says you cannot send abortifacients via the US postal system or common carriers, there's a big question. Like, we know that that would affect mifepristone, but does it also affect misoprostol? Does it also affect curettes? Does it affect manual vacuum aspirators? Does it affect specula? Like, what is going to be the extent of that? And that is a way that the government could reduce access to misoprostol. The other thing that we've seen, and again, it's a novel mechanism of restricting access that's happened in Louisiana. And unfortunately, these anti-choice states all talk to each other. And so when it rolls out in one place, you can better believe they're going to try to roll it out elsewhere, which is the state legislature earlier this year, it went into effect October 1st, now has reclassified both mifepristone and misoprostol as um, uh, drugs that need heightened surveillance in the same way that you would regulate narcotics.
Mm.
And the idea is that without a prescription, you're not allowed to possess these drugs. And so in hospitals, they have to be under lock and key. The irony here, again, is that all of our patients have legitimate prescriptions for mifepristone and misoprostol. We don't send them a piece of paper that they go to a pharmacy, but we're writing them prescriptions. So all the mifepristone and misoprostol we send is prescription. But in hospitals now in Louisiana, these really important medications are now really hard to get. They're no longer on crash carts, they're no longer as accessible. And that is also going to have implications for obstetric care because we use misoprostol in so many ways in obstetrics. And so I think that misoprostol in some states there will be a move to further regulate it like that. And again, it will have less impact on the abortion space than it will on obstetrics.
Okay, I'm going to sneak in one more question.
Okay.
And it's a good one to end on, which is the perennial question that navel gazers have here in Canada is, with all that's happening in the US and the potential now for a conservative government, the likelihood of a conservative government here in Canada, what are your worries about Canada? What do you think is going to happen?
Oh my gosh, so I am worried about a number of things. I am not worried about abortion rights being sort of stripped in Canada. That I am not worried about. I am worried about a couple of things though. First, the US exports its crazies to Canada all the time. And we've seen that, and I think we're going to see more of that, and that's really depressing. Second, I think that with a conservative government in Canada, some of the things both for Canadians and in the international space will get rolled back. So the Sexual and Reproductive Health Fund that came into effect and has been part of the federal budget for domestic work to expand access not only to abortion, but sexual and reproductive health that came into effect or that came into place after COVID, I can see that getting rolled back. The feminist foreign assistance agenda that has created which was an enormous stopgap in terms of responding to the harms of the global gag rule that came under the first Trump administration. I could see that getting rolled back by a conservative Canadian administration. And so I think, unfortunately, some of the space that Canada has been able to play both globally and then some of the work that has happened within Canada nationally, I could see that getting rolled back or being halted. Having said that, I will just end on something optimistic that we know that the Premier of New Brunswick recently, after decades, has finally decided to do away with the regulations around 8420 that really prevented funding from being used for instrumentation or procedural abortions outside of hospitals in New Brunswick. I think that looks like it's going to stick. It looks like there's going to be real expanded access to funded abortion care in New Brunswick, which I think is really important. So I think the theater may play out in Canada more at the provincial level in the immediate wake of the next federal elections. And as bad as I think it could be in Canada, I don't think it will be anywhere as bad it has been in the United States. And so I know right now there's been a lot of talk about, what do we need to do in Canada to fortify abortion rights and abortion law? And I will just say, let me also just say, if you told me 10 years ago that Roe would be overturned, I would have said you were crazy because 50 years, at that point, 40 years of precedent was 40 years of precedent. So anything can happen. But I do think the frameworks in Canada and um, the legal protections for abortion being part of the health system are so much more ingrained in law and policy that it would be really hard to have a comparable kind of outcome.
Think you what you said is so true. The greatest worry is all the crazies pouring north and the
Yeah,
crazy rhetoric pouring north, which will just make it, an unpleasant space to be in, but not change maybe much on the ground. I'm informed by the director of the Health Law Center that your slides will be available on the center's website, so you don't need to worry about
okay.
communicating information from them. If you're interested in how to get in touch with the project, how to donate to the project, the website is on the slides, and those will be on the center's website. And I am really, really grateful that you joined us from so far away at such an early time. It's really early in the morning in Sydney, because this was incredibly important. And I also want to just congratulate you on what an amazing thing that you did. It's been a long haul, and you're still going. And congratulations.
Thanks.
You've made such a big difference, and that's not something that it's not something that scholars usually get to say. So you're a scholar activist that has really made a big difference. So congratulations, and thank you so much for sharing your time.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you everyone for joining us. Please stay on the mailing list, the email list, for future notifications around webinars, and we hope to see you again. Have a good evening, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.